Garland Taylor's shoes tread softly on the marble floor of the hall. The high ceilings of Beacon Hill seemed to press down on his shoulders. Tuesday night, 9:30, too late for a business dinner, too early to go up to the bedroom where Beatrice was probably already ensconced with her laptop and the profitability charts of her fitness centers. He stopped at the bar, splashed some scotch into a glass, and froze at the French window. October darkness enveloped the garden, where the gardener had spent the afternoon removing the last of the fallen leaves. A perfect lawn, a perfect house, a perfect life from the outside. Garland grinned and took a sip. 10 years ago, things had been different. Back then, he and Beatrice could sit in this very living room for hours, discussing plans for the future. She, a young business school graduate, was burning with the idea of creating something of her own. He had just gotten his first promotion at an investment fund. They met at a charity event, and 6 months later, all the newspapers wrote about their wedding. Beatrice inherited a small gym from her father and turned it into an empire. Elite Body was now known to everyone in the highest circles of Boston. 6 premium clubs where bankers and lawyers' wives worked out by day and multi-million-dollar deals were made in the sauna at night. Garland saw his wife change with each new opening, tougher, colder, more and more like his brand, flawless on the outside, empty on the inside. He himself now managed assets that exceeded the budget of a small state. His every word on the board of directors affected stock prices. He had learned to smile at the right people and make the tough decisions. Only at home, that mask was cracking. Beatrice's muffled voice came from the second-floor office as she held another conference call with the managers. Garland cringed, remembering how much he'd once loved hearing her voice. Now her every word sounded like a corporate textbook, polished, calibrated, lifeless. Their bedrooms were at opposite ends of the hallway for the second year. Different schedules, they explained to their friends. Beatrice gets up early, and I often work late. In truth, they were just tired of pretending. The only thing that still bound them together was a tangled web of shared investments and business contacts. Divorce would mean ruin for both of them. The ringing of the phone cut through the silence of the house. Garland pulled out his smartphone. The number belonged to his deputy. A new project demanded attention, a major deal that would change the balance of power in Boston's financial world. He finished his scotch and headed for his office. The desk was littered with papers that needed his signature. Out of the corner of his eye, he noticed a silver-framed photograph of him and Beatrice at a fundraiser 5 years ago. She was smiling at the camera. He was staring off into the distance. Even then, they'd begun to drift apart. They just hadn't admitted it to themselves yet. Garland turned on the desk lamp and plunged into his work. Somewhere in the business center of Boston, in the office of a large law firm, a young woman was leaning over similar documents. Her decision was about to set off a chain of events that would change the lives of the Taylor family forever. But for now, no one knew about it. The house was dead silent, broken only by Beatrice's muffled voice from her study and the rustling of papers. The maid was silently collecting the dishes after dinner, which neither of the couple had touched. Another perfect evening in a perfect house. Sloane Pierce fixed her perfectly styled blonde hair as she walked through the glass doors of the Ritz-Carlton Hotel. The annual reception of the New England Financiers Association was considered one of the highlights of the business season. Her firm had gone to great lengths to get 2 invitation cards, and the partners had insisted that one of them go to her. In her mid-20s, she had already earned a reputation as a ruthless corporate lawyer. Her specialty was complex mergers that required a keen attention to detail and a 10-step vision. Tonight could be a pivotal night in her career, as the guests included representatives from some of the largest investment funds on the East Coast. The large banquet hall sparkled with crystal chandeliers, evening gowns and tuxedos, the muffled hum of voices, the clinking of glasses. Everything created the atmosphere of an exquisite reception. Sloane moved slowly between the groups of people talking, mentally noting the key figures of the financial world. Garland Taylor stood by the fireplace, absent-mindedly listening to the next person. His dark suit perfectly emphasized his athletic figure, and the sparse gray hair on his temples only added to his solidity. He was absent-mindedly fiddling with a glass of mineral water when he noticed Sloane approaching. Their gazes met for only a moment, but it was enough for something to change in the air. She noted with a professional eye the quality of his suit, the expensive cufflinks, the confident posture of a man accustomed to authority. He had time to notice the gracefulness of her movements, and how elegantly the dark blue silk of her dress emphasized her slender figure. The conversation about new trends in the merger market started as if by itself. They were both experienced enough in small talk to study each other discreetly while discussing the latest deals. Her sharp mind and professional knowledge clearly impressed him. His quiet confidence and deep understanding of the market intrigued her. Waiters glided silently between the guests with trays of hors d'oeuvres and champagne. Time seemed to stop in their corner of the hall. They talked about work, but there was a second meaning behind every phrase, an unspoken question behind every look. By the end of the evening, they had exchanged business cards, a mere formality in the business world. But the touch of their fingers lasted a little longer than necessary. In the cab on the way home, Sloane pulled out his card several times, running her finger over the embossed letters. When Garland returned to his empty mansion, he stood at the window for a long time, remembering every detail of their conversation. A week later, her firm received an offer of partnership from the Taylor Foundation. 2 weeks later, they met at a restaurant to discuss the details of the contract. After another month, business meetings became regular, and conversations increasingly strayed away from professional topics. One evening, after staying up late working on documents in his office, they found themselves too close to each other. The heady smell of her perfume, the heat of his palm on her shoulder. The moment lasted an eternity until their lips met in their first kiss. They both knew something dangerous was happening, but they couldn't stop now, or didn't want to. In the whirlpool of secret meetings and stolen moments, they didn't notice they were being pulled deeper and deeper, until one day, this secret turned into a time bomb, ready to destroy their lives. The morning began as usual. Beatrice got up at 5:30, walked silently to her bathroom, habitually avoiding the creaking floorboards by the door. Garland could hear the water running noisily, the flick of a switch, the clacking of heels on the marble floor of the hall. She always arrived at the main clubhouse for the opening, personally checking that the trainers were ready and the equipment was clean. He rose later, when the sun was already casting a cool fall light on the bedroom. He was waking up with a smile more and more often lately. Mrs. Porter, the housekeeper who had been working for them for 8 years, noticed the change but prudently kept quiet. She served breakfast in the sunny dining room, where Garland leisurely perused the stock market reports. In the office, the usual bustle awaited him. Martha, his assistant, had placed on his desk a folder of documents on a new project, the same one Sloane's law firm was working on. A formal occasion for another meeting. They'd seen each other 4 times in the past 2 weeks, each time finding increasingly complex legal issues that required face-to-face discussion. Monk's restaurant on a quiet street in the Back Bay had become their sanctuary. A private office, well-trained waiters, no familiar faces. Sloane always arrived first, ordered a glass of red wine, and waited, nervously fidgeting with her napkin. Garland showed up at exactly the appointed time. They both knew they only had an hour. Their conversations began with a discussion of contracts and numbers, but invariably slipped into the personal. She talked about her childhood in a small town in Vermont, how she'd worked her way through law school, how she'd turned down dates to study. He talked about his first steps in business, how he'd met Beatrice, how their marriage had gradually turned into a business partnership. That evening, Beatrice stayed late at the club. They were preparing to open the 7th outlet of the chain. Garland had sent word that it would be late, an important meeting with investors. She and Sloane strolled along the Charles River waterfront, the first time they'd ever been out in public together. The fall wind ruffled her hair. She wrapped herself in his coat. They talked about the future, carefully avoiding the main question. At home, Garland found Beatrice in her study. She didn't even look up from her laptop, mumbling something like a greeting. Sales charts flashed on the screen, and she frowned, making notes in her notebook. She hadn't been interested in where he disappeared to in the evenings for a long time. Neither did he care why she was spending more and more nights in the city apartment above her main club. They spent weekends apart. Beatrice flew off to fitness industry conferences or met with potential investors. Garland would make up business trips or important meetings. In reality, he and Sloane were retiring to a country hotel 2 hours outside of Boston. There, in a secluded lakeside cottage, they could forget about everything. But one morning, he noticed Beatrice taking an unusually long look at a restaurant bill that had accidentally fallen out of his jacket. He carelessly explained it away as a business dinner. She pretended to believe it. But something changed in her gaze. A wariness appeared. Sloane could sense the growing tension too. She was talking more and more about the future, about how they had to decide something. There was a demanding tone in her voice. She was tired of being a secret, tired of hiding, tired of sharing him with another woman. The office was getting anxious too. Martha mused meaningfully one day as she handed him an envelope with the law firm's logo on it. The board of directors began to whisper about their managing director's strange behavior. His decisions remained impeccable, but everyone noticed how he constantly checked his phone, how absent-minded he was in meetings. In the evenings in the empty mansion, he would stand at the window for long periods of time, looking out at the city lights, trying to imagine how things might have turned out differently. In the other room, Beatrice was also awake, leafing through old photo albums and the reports of the private detective she had hired 3 weeks ago. And in her apartment in the trendy South End neighborhood, Sloane sat on the windowsill, clutching her phone in her hands. Beatrice's number had long been saved in her contacts. Her finger hovered over the call button, but each time she put off the decision until tomorrow. Fall in Boston was unusually cold. The chilly wind from the bay was chilling to the bone, and the gray sky seemed to weigh down on the city with a leaden weight. Sloane sat in her office on the 32nd floor, watching the rain blur the outlines of the skyscrapers. On the desk was a partnership proposal from a large law firm in Chicago. She'd received it a week ago, but still hadn't responded. Moving to another city could be the solution to all her problems, or the end of everything. Her phone vibrated. A message from Garland. "Meet me at 7. Need to talk." She swiped her finger across the screen, erasing the text. Their meetings lately were ending more and more often in heavy conversations. She demanded certainty. He talked about the complexity of the situation. The restaurant was unusually crowded. Their usual private office was occupied, and they were seated at a table at the back of the room. Garland looked tired, with shadows under his eyes and wrinkles on his forehead. He fiddled with his cufflinks, a habit acquired in moments of excitement. "I can't do this anymore," Sloane said quietly but firmly. "I've been offered a position in Chicago, a partnership at the firm. I have to give you an answer by the end of the week." She pulled the paperwork out of her purse and placed it in front of him. Garland slowly ran his hand over his face as if erasing an invisible mask. Their conversation had been going on for hours. The waiters had already begun to clear the neighboring tables, and they kept talking. About his obligations to investors, about his reputation in business circles, about his joint business with Beatrice, about her career, her dreams, her desire for simple human happiness. "Give me time." His voice sounded almost pleading. "I have to get this right. One wrong move and we lose everything." Sloane grinned bitterly. She'd heard it dozens of times before. Time was slipping through their fingers, turning their love into an agonizing weight. That night was the first time they'd had a real fight. In the hotel room they'd arrived in after the restaurant, the tension that had been building up had broken through. She screamed that she was tired of being a secret, that she didn't want to waste her youth on endless waiting. He tried to explain the complexity of the financial relationship with Beatrice, talked about the millions of dollars he would lose in a divorce. In the morning, Garland returned home with a headache and a feeling of utter devastation. Beatrice had already left for the club. Her schedule was unchanged. There were papers waiting in the office that needed attention. The shares of their joint ventures had fallen for the second week in a row. It was as if the market sensed the tension between the owners. There was an unusual atmosphere in the office. Martha had put the latest newspapers on the desk, and on the front page of the financial section was a photo of Beatrice with a headline about the expansion of the club chain to the West Coast. Garland recalled that he hadn't even known about these plans. He and his wife had long ago stopped discussing anything but the numbers in the reports. That evening he sat in the car in front of the house for a long time, hesitating to get in. The phone glowed with an unread message from Sloane. I've made a decision. We need to talk." Somewhere inside, he knew she was right, that you can't keep balancing two lives forever, that it was time to make a choice. The light was on in Beatrice's bedroom, the first time she'd been home before him in weeks. On the living room table was a stack of papers with her law firm's logo on them. She hadn't even tried to hide them. Apparently, she was preparing for the inevitable, too. Garland poured himself a whiskey and stepped out onto the terrace. Boston at night spread out before him in a sea of lights. Somewhere out there, in the apartment overlooking the river, Sloane was awake, too, staring at the same lights. And in the office behind him, Beatrice was methodically laying out papers, preparing for the war that was about to begin. Sloane awoke to the sound of her own screaming. The nightmare that had haunted her the last few nights was dissolving into the pre-dawn twilight, leaving behind a clammy fear and a suffocating sense of loneliness. The clock read 4:30 in the morning. Her apartment was in perfect order, everything in its place, everything in its proper place. Only on the coffee table in the living room was a stack of papers, the results of the work of the private investigator she'd hired 2 weeks ago. Photographs, bank statements, movement reports, Beatrice Taylor's life, organized into folders. In the kitchen, she machine-brewed coffee, but didn't even touch the cup. The phone had been silent for the third 24 hours, since the night Garland had asked her to wait again. "Just a little more time," his words echoed in her head. "I'll take care of it." She arrived at the office earlier than usual. The windows of her office looked directly onto Taylor's investment fund building. She could see his office window, could watch the lights come on in the morning. It had become a ritual of sorts, waiting for Garland's silhouette to appear behind the glass. The day dragged on endlessly. Sloane missed 2 meetings, canceled a meeting with an important client. Her assistant Jane peered anxiously into her office, but hesitated to ask anything. There was a letter from Chicago on the desk. They were waiting for a reply. There was hardly any time left for reflection. At 3 o'clock in the afternoon came a message from Garland. "Can't meet today. Important family dinner. Talk to you tomorrow." Sloane felt nausea coming up to her throat. Family dinner. Another perfect picture for the society pages, the successful Taylor couple in their immaculate home. By evening, she was on edge. The bottle of wine, saved for a special occasion, was half empty. The phone lay nearby, drawing her gaze. She had Beatrice's number memorized by heart, though she had never called it. Her fingers trembled as she dialed the numbers. The final preparations for dinner were underway at the Taylor mansion. Beatrice was personally checking the table settings, reprimanding the maid for insufficiently ironed napkins. Tonight they were hosting important guests, members of the board of directors and their wives. The occasion was a good one, the 10th anniversary of their marriage. Garland lingered in the office, delaying the moment of returning home. He was going over the documents he was going to give to the lawyer account statements, articles of incorporation, prenuptial agreements, anything that could help minimize his losses in the divorce. Beatrice had chosen an austere black Chanel dress for dinner, jewelry, only a wedding ring and a thin string of pearls around her neck. At the same time, Sloane sat in her apartment, clutching the phone with whitened fingers. The wine had given her courage, but her voice was still shaking. She'd rehearsed this conversation 100 times, going over every word in her head. Garland was just pulling up to the house when he saw the text from Sloane. "I'm sorry. I have to do this." He went cold, realizing the meaning of those words. The car turned sharply into the driveway. The first guests were already gathering in the lobby. Beatrice stood at the stairs, smiling and shaking hands in greeting. Her cell phone lay on the living room table, the screen glowing with an incoming call. Garland ran up the steps, skipping over 2. Too late. Beatrice took the phone and, after apologizing to her guests, went up to the second-floor living room. Garland froze on the top step, watching his wife take a seat in the chair by the fireplace, bringing the phone to her ear. From the hallway came the voices of new guests, the clinking of glasses and soft music. "Hello?" Beatrice's voice sounded habitually subdued. Garland saw the expression on her face change: bewilderment, surprise, anger. She rose slowly from her chair, turning toward the window. Her fingers clenched the phone so white her knuckles turned white. He stepped into the living room. Beatrice spoke softly, minting every word. A crystal wine glass, forgotten on the mantelpiece, reflected the flames of the candles, casting a blood-red glare on the walls. The logs crackled in the fireplace, giving the illusion of coziness. "So that's how it is." Beatrice turned slowly to her husband. Fury flashed in her eyes. The phone was still pressed to her ear. "Did you hear everything, darling? Your little friend decided to share the details." Garland took a step forward. Time seemed to stop. From downstairs came the laughter of the guests, the sounds of a piano. Someone had decided to entertain the audience with music. And here, in the twilight of the second-floor parlor, their carefully constructed world was crumbling. Beatrice tossed the phone onto the couch and grabbed her wine glass. 10 years, Garland, 10 years of pretending. And for what? For some... The wine splashed in his face, dark drops trickling down his white shirt. He grabbed her wrist, squeezing it too hard. Beatrice shrieked, trying to break free. The glass slipped from her hand and shattered on the mantelpiece. Shards scattered across the Persian rug, mixing with drops of wine. "Hush," his voice sounded hoarse. "There are guests downstairs." Beatrice laughed, loudly, hysterically. Her laughter echoed off the walls, drowning out the music from downstairs. She wrenched her hand away and retreated to the fireplace. "Guests? Do you care about guests?" Her hand fumbled for a heavy bronze statuette on the mantelpiece, an award for last year's business accomplishments. "What about my reputation? My business? Everything we've built?" The first blow caught him off guard. The statuette split the air, grazing his cheekbone. Garland recoiled, feeling a hot trickle run down his cheek. Beatrice swung again, but he intercepted her arm. They struggled in silence, breathing heavily. The statuette slipped from her fingers, fell to the carpet with a thud. Beatrice wriggled in his grip, trying to break free, to punch, to scratch his face. Her pearl necklace broke, the beads rolling across the floor, mingling with the shards of the glass. Downstairs, someone began to make a toast. The voices of the guests grew louder. The music died down. And in the living room on the second floor, two people who had recently been married were circling the fireplace in a final, deadly dance. An hour later, police cars were pulling up to the mansion. Detective Grayson McCall parked a little to the side, watching the commotion at the entrance. His partner, Esther Dunham, was going over the first notes in her notebook. "Mrs. Taylor, 35, owner of a chain of fitness clubs. Mr. Taylor is missing. Signs of a struggle." McCall shook his head. In 20 years on the job, he'd learned to sense when a case wasn't as simple as it seemed. On the second floor of the mansion, the forensics team was already working on gathering evidence. Dawn was beginning to break outside the windows, coloring the Boston sky an unsettling grayish pink. Detective Grayson McCall showed up at Elite Body's main office at 8 a.m. sharp. Despite the early hour, the reception area was already crowded with journalists. The news of Beatrice Taylor's murder had made the morning news. Esther Dunham, his partner, was methodically recording the receptionist's testimony. A young girl in a strict uniform was nervously rubbing her name tag, Crystal, trying to recall the minute details of yesterday. Mrs. Taylor was here until 6 this evening, checking reports, meeting with contractors for the new clubhouse. Nothing out of the ordinary. Crystal faltered. Although she seemed a little distracted, asked me twice to repeat the meeting information. Beatrice's office was in perfect order. Stacks of documents neatly arranged in folders, charts of the company's growth on the wall, photos from the opening of each new club in the chain. McCall scrutinized the entries in the dead woman's day planner. "Strange," he muttered, scrutinizing the last page. "The week before she died, she canceled all her important appointments. Right here, look." He showed Esther's notes. "Meeting with investors, presentation of a new project all canceled." Elite Body's CFO, a gray-haired man with a tenacious gaze, tapped his fingers nervously on the table as he questioned. "Mrs. Taylor has been behaving unconventionally for the past 2 weeks, requested a full audit of all company accounts, interested in the possibility of asset division. By lunchtime, detectives had interviewed 20 employees at the main office. A picture of the last few days of Beatrice's life was beginning to emerge. A successful businesswoman suddenly changing her usual routine, canceling meetings, conducting strange financial audits. She was preparing for something, Esther remarked, reviewing the records. Probably learned something important. McCall nodded, looking at the crime scene photos. A luxurious living room, signs of a struggle, a broken glass, scattered pearls. At 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the results of the forensics on the victim's cell phone arrived. The last incoming call was from an unregistered number. The call lasted 7 minutes. Immediately afterwards, Beatrice called her lawyer, but he didn't answer. "Check all calls made in the last month," McCall ordered, "and find that lawyer." Esther was already leafing through the database on her tablet. Found it. Martin Schwartz, partner at Goldman & Associates, specializes in divorce litigation. By late afternoon, the detectives were back at the station. The first photos appeared on the board, notes, arrows connecting the facts. In the center was a photo of Beatrice Taylor from a charity event. Successful, beautiful, alive. Next to it, in blood-red marker, the time of death. "I don't like the robbery version." Esther spread the reports out on the table. "Too many coincidences. Cancelled appointments, a call to a lawyer, financial checks." McCall tapped his pencil thoughtfully on the desk. "Where's the husband now? Why isn't his phone available?" Late that night, the forensic results from the crime scene came in. The fingerprints on the bronze statue, the blood spatter on the fireplace, the signs of a struggle all indicated that Beatrice Taylor knew her killer. And not just knew him, let him into the house, trusted him. The next morning, the detectives were to visit the chain's main fitness club. That's where the staff said Beatrice had spent the most time in recent weeks. Perhaps the walls of the fancy establishment held the answers to the questions that multiplied with every hour of the investigation. The library of the Taylor mansion looked untouched by the drama playing out the floor above. The leather spines of the books gleamed in the light of the desk lamp. The heavy drapes muffled the sounds of rain outside the window. Detective McCall was seated in a massive mahogany chair. His partner Esther Dunham perched a little farther back, ready to record every word of the witnesses. James Anderson, chairman of the board of directors, entered first. His perfectly tailored suit and gold glasses created the image of a man accustomed to power and comfort. "We arrived around 7 this evening," he began, tapping his fingers on the arm of his chair. Beatrice greeted the guests at the stairs. Black Chanel dress, pearl necklace, she looked as flawless as ever. "Did you notice anything unusual about her behavior?" Anderson hesitated, took off his glasses, began wiping them with a silk handkerchief. "Perhaps not. Although, she seemed a little distracted, asked twice about the dates of the next board meeting." Next up was Margaret Wilson, wife of the company's general counsel. A graceful woman in her 50s, she was nervously rubbing a string of pearls, the same one she had worn around Beatrice's neck the previous evening. Jonathan was playing the piano he always plays at the Taylor's receptions. Chopin, I think. Then someone put on some jazz. It was quite noisy. Everyone was talking, laughing, just a regular social evening. She fell silent, blotting her eyes with a lace handkerchief. "Who would have thought?" "Tell me about Mr. Taylor," Esther asked softly. "Garland? He was, around here somewhere. Greeted us. Had a word with James about the stock. Typical Garland. Low-key, impeccably polite." Elizabeth Ashton, Beatrice's friend since college, held herself more confidently than the others. Her testimony was precise, as if calibrated. Beatrice went upstairs around 8. A phone call. She said it was important. "I noticed Garland going after her. Thought," she stammered, "thought maybe it was something urgent on business." "Did you hear them talking?" "No, the music was playing too loud. The pianist was just starting something from Liszt, those endless passages." Richard Grant, Garland's golfing partner, was clearly out of sorts. His tanned face was covered with sweat, his tie bunched sideways. Saw a glimpse of Garland by the stairs. He looked strange, twitchy or something, not his usual self. I wanted to talk to him about the new project, but he literally disappeared. "What time was that?" "Honestly, I don't remember exactly. Time was kind of going weird that night. It was all a blur." Sarah Higgins, socialite and regular customer at Beatrice's fitness clubs, smoked nervously, flicking ash into an antique ashtray. "The music was playing loud. Everyone was having fun. I danced with my husband, then chatted with Elizabeth." "Beatrice? Yes, I saw her go upstairs. Did she look worried? No, more like determined. By evening, 23 people had been interviewed. The testimony was adding up in a strange mosaic. No one had heard the screams. No one had seen the struggle. Garland Taylor seemed to vanish into thin air after 8 o'clock that evening. The phone call caught McCall as he was looking through the crime scene photos. The woman's voice in the receiver sounded tense. Detective? This is Sloane Pierce. I need to talk to you. It's regarding Beatrice and Garland Taylor. I know what happened that night. Sloane's apartment was on the 20th floor of a modern complex overlooking the river. McCall called for a support team. His intuition told him he might need one. Sloane opened the door immediately. A tall blonde in a strict suit, she seemed focused, but her trembling hands and hunted look gave her away. Come in. She led the detective into the spacious living room. I have something to tell you. I was the one who called Beatrice that night. The clink of shattering glass cut short her words. A bullet whizzed through the air where her head had been a second ago. McCall reacted instantly, knocking Sloane to the ground. They rolled behind the couch in a hail of shards from the crystal chandelier. Don't move, the detective whispered, drawing his gun. Somewhere in the hallway, footsteps were heard. It's him. Sloane's voice shook. Garland, he's come to finish what he started. Honey. Taylor's voice sounded unnaturally calm. You realize I couldn't have done otherwise, don't you? One phone call and you've ruined everything I've spent years building. How did you ruin Beatrice's life? Sloane rose slowly, ignoring McCall's cautionary gesture. She loved you, believed you. Loved? Garland laughed bitterly. She loved her clubs, her empire. I was just a fortunate acquisition. And you were the real thing. Lower your weapon, Mr. Taylor. McCall aimed at his chest. The building is surrounded. You know what the funny thing is? It was as if Garland hadn't heard the detective. I really loved you, was willing to give up everything, but you couldn't wait. You did it your way. You killed her. Sloane's voice was ringing with tension. Strangled her with your own hands, and now you've come to kill me. Garland's finger tensed on the trigger. You left me a choice? She would have destroyed me. Took everything. My money, my reputation, my business. And now, the SWAT team burst in simultaneously from 3 directions. The shot rang out deafeningly. The bullet entered the wall a centimeter from Sloane's head. Garland collapsed under the weight of the 3 fighters, his gun flying off to the side. You have the right to remain silent, McCall began, snapping on the handcuffs. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. The apartment window overlooked the nighttime Boston skyline. The flashing lights of police cars painted the walls of the buildings in red and blue colors. The rain intensified, blurring the lights of the city. Garland Taylor sat in the interrogation room of the police station, his impeccable posture and expensive suit seeming out of place against the gray walls. His right hand, handcuffed to the table, trembled slightly, the only sign of tension. Detective McCall placed the crime scene photos in front of him. A bronze statuette with traces of blood, a broken glass, scattered pearls on the carpet. Tell me about the evening of the reception, Mr. Taylor. Garland ran his left hand over his face, the abrasion on his cheekbone already beginning to heal. We're having a dinner in honor of Beatrice and I's 10th anniversary. 23 guests, close friends, business associates. Go on. It was business as usual. Jonathan played the piano, champagne was served, Beatrice was in a wonderful mood. He fell silent, looking at his hands. And then the phone rang. McCall pushed the call printout toward him. 7 minutes of conversation from an unknown number. I don't know who called. Garland yanked his chained hand. Beatrice went upstairs to talk. And you followed her. Yes, I was worried. She's been strange, canceling appointments, doing some kind of checkups. Esther Dunham entered the room, placing a new folder in front of McCall. Photos appeared on the table. Garland and Sloane in a restaurant on the waterfront at the hotel entrance. Familiar faces, Mr. Taylor? His face petrified. I won't talk without a lawyer. In the adjoining interrogation room, Sloane Pierce was testifying. Her voice sounded steady, only the fingers clutching the glass of water gave away her excitement. We met at a reception to celebrate the launch of a new investment fund. Garland was different. not like all those other financiers. He listened. When did the affair begin? A month later. First it was business meetings discussing contracts, then everything changed. Tell me about Beatrice's phone call. Sloane set the glass down, a watery stain spreading across the table. I couldn't live like that anymore. The secret meetings, the lies, the constant fear of exposure. Garland promised a divorce, but he kept putting it off and putting it off. What exactly did you tell Mrs. Taylor? The truth, that we've been having an affair for 6 months, that Garland was going to leave her, that I have proof, photographs, letters, tapes of conversations. In the police chief's office, the investigation team is gathered. On the blackboard are photos, notes, diagrams, a story written in red marker and black blood. We have a motive. McCall tapped a pencil on Beatrice's photo. She found out about the affair, was preparing for a divorce. It threatened Taylor with losing millions. Their prenup wasn't drafted in his favor. And opportunity, Esther added. He was in the house, went up after her. No one heard the screams over the music. And now the attempted murder of Sloane Pierce. The police chief looked at the photos of the shot apartment. He wanted to silence her. Interrogation room again. Garland still sits upright, but his face is slimmer, shadows under his eyes. You do realize we know everything, right? McCall spreads out the new documents in front of him. The financial audits Beatrice started, the meetings with the lawyer, her call to the bank an hour before she died. I loved her, Garland said suddenly. I really did once, and then everything became so empty. Business dinners, social gatherings, endless talk of money. And then there was Sloane. She was different. Alive. Real. He looked at his hands as if he were seeing them for the first time. I didn't want to. Beatrice just left me no choice. The courtroom of the Eastern District of Massachusetts was unaccustomedly quiet. The tall windows let in sunlight that streaked the pews in golden stripes. Garland Taylor sat motionless, staring straight ahead. Prosecutor Melissa Richardson rose from her seat. Her strict suit and confident movements spoke of years of experience. Your Honor, gentlemen of the jury, you have before you a man who planned and carried out the murder of his wife in cold blood. Not in a fit of rage, not out of passion. He killed the woman he'd lived with for 10 years because she interfered with his plans. Sloane Pierce was the first to testify. In a strict gray suit, she seemed older than her 29 years. It all started at the reception. Garland talked about how unhappy he was in his marriage, how he and Beatrice were estranged. I believed him. I believed every word. When did you find out about the financial side of their marriage? About 3 months after our relationship began. Garland mentioned a prenuptial agreement. In the event of divorce, he would lose control of the joint assets, about 70% of his estate. The financial expert provided the court with a detailed analysis. The Taylor couple's fortune was estimated to be in the hundreds of millions of dollars. Most of the assets were recorded in Beatrice's name. Mr. Taylor began withdrawing money as early as a month before the murder. The expert pointed to charts. Small amounts, through shell companies. He was preparing. James Anderson, the chairman of the board of directors, looked 10 years older. Beatrice suspected something. She ordered an unscheduled audit, looked into all the transactions, and then he took off his glasses, rubbed his eyes tiredly. Then there was that phone call. Detective McCall read the transcript of Garland's interrogation. When she went up to the living room with the phone, I followed her. Heard the end of the conversation. Beatrice knew everything. About Sloane, about the money being taken out, about my plans. She laughed and said she was going to destroy me. The crime lab sergeant presented the forensic results. Traces of blood on the bronze statue, skin particles under the victim's fingernails. DNA on the glass shards, all pointing to Mr. Taylor. The defense attorney tried to build a case of self-defense, that Beatrice grabbed the statue first, that Garland was defending himself. Look at these pictures. The prosecutor spread out the crime scene photos. Scattered pearls, broken glass, signs of a struggle. This isn't self-defense, this is murder. Sloane was called back in to testify. She recounted her last encounter with Garland, his attempt to kill her. He was calm, absolutely calm when he was aiming at me, said I ruined everything with my phone call, but in fact he ruined it all himself, with his lies, his greed, his selfishness. Detective Constable Esther Dunham presented the findings to the court. Mr. Taylor acted on a clear plan. He knew his wife was preparing for divorce. He knew he was going to lose everything. Murder seemed to be his only option. Garland listened to the testimony motionless. Only the jowls in his cheekbones betrayed his tension. His manicured hands, which had recently held glasses at social gatherings, were now handcuffed. The jury deliberated briefly. The foreperson, an elderly woman with a kind face, read the verdict. On the charge of murder in the first degree of Beatrice Taylor, guilty. On the charge of attempted murder of Sloane Pierce, guilty. The judge announced the sentence: life in prison without parole. There was absolute silence in the courtroom. Only a ray of sunshine was still scrawling the floor in golden streaks, indifferent to human tragedies. Elite body fitness clubs kept their name. The new board of directors decided that Beatrice Taylor's reputation as a successful businesswoman was more important than scandalous headlines. Detectives Grayson McCall and Esther Dunham returned to their regular jobs. Another photo of the solved case appeared on McCall's office wall, a simple black-and-white printout without a signature. Sloane Pierce had moved to Chicago. She'd been promoted to junior partner at the law firm. She no longer took divorce cases, and the Beacon Hill mansion stood empty. No more lights burned outside the tall windows, no more music played. Only in the evenings did the wind sway the branches of the old maple tree, casting fanciful shadows on the marble steps where Beatrice Taylor had once greeted her last guests.